He was known as the man who handed out sweets to children. In a quiet Texas neighborhood full of modest homes and simple lives, he was the guy who smiled freely, offered rides, and ran the family candy business with care. Everyone called him the Candy Man, but the name took on a nightmarish meaning in the summer of 1973, when the walls of normalcy collapsed and the buried truth began to claw its way into the sunlight. It was then the country realized this friendly face was hiding one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. At least 28 teenage boys were dead, lured to their deaths by the very hands they trusted. Their torturer, Dean Corll. Their betrayers, two boys just like them, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks. What happened inside that ordinary white-paneled house in Houston Heights still chills even seasoned detectives. This wasn't just a serial killer story. It was a betrayal of youth, a story of manipulation, silence, and evil that fed on trust. In the heart of Houston Heights, Dean Corll seemed unremarkable. Born in 1939, raised in a working-class family, he lived with a mild demeanor and an agreeable attitude. His family's candy business made him a familiar sight around the neighborhood, especially to the younger kids. He wasn't flashy, didn't cause trouble, and he always had a smile for the locals. His house was a stopover spot for teens with nowhere else to go. He had candy, sodas, and a working TV. For many, he was the adult who never judged, who never asked too many questions. What no one knew was that this soft-spoken man had turned his house into a trap, one that would swallow nearly 30 lives over just 3 years. The disappearances began in 1970. Boys vanished without a trace, one after another. Police rarely sounded alarms. In those years, missing teens were often labeled runaways, dismissed as kids who got tired of rules and struck out on their own. Parents were told not to worry. Postcards even showed up, allegedly from the missing boys, claiming they'd found work or were traveling. But the handwriting wasn't quite right, and the language in the notes, too formal, too rehearsed, never sounded like a 15-year-old. Still, authorities showed little urgency. There was no forensic technology linking these disappearances, no clear patterns. The cases piled up quietly in drawers and filing cabinets. David Brooks was among the first to fall under Corll's influence. A teenager craving attention and belonging, he spent a lot of time at Corll's home, accepting gifts and eventually money. Brooks was offered $200 for every boy he could bring to Corll. At first, he claimed not to know what happened to them. It was all part of a made-up story Corll fed him. Something about a child trafficking ring, a scheme that sounded too dark to be real. But Brooks played along. He lured boys to the house, knowing they never came back out. Soon another teen entered Corll's circle, Elmer Wayne Henley. Born in 1955 and raised in poverty, Henley wanted to help his struggling mother. When Corll approached him with an offer of easy money, Henley accepted. He later said he believed the story at first, that Corll was selling the boys into a prostitution ring or shipping them off to some underground operation. But that version of the lie didn't last long. Eventually, Corll let Henley see the truth. By then, Henley wasn't just delivering victims, he was helping to restrain, torture, and kill them. Corll's home had become a full-fledged torture chamber. Inside one of the rooms was a large plywood board, reinforced and drilled with holes. Shackles were attached to the wall. Victims were chained to this board, stripped of clothes and dignity, and subjected to hours, sometimes days, of torment. Corll often drugged them with barbiturates. Other times, he used brute force. Victims were bound with tape or nylon rope. Some were beaten with wooden boards or whips. Some were strangled with electrical cords. Others were shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Each murder followed a sickening ritual, performed with the help or direct involvement of Henley and Brooks. Bodies were not simply discarded. Corll treated disposal with calculated precision. He wrapped the corpses in plastic sheeting, often treating them with lime to mask odor and decay. Then he buried them in one of 3 places: a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, a desolate stretch of beach at High Island, and a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn, where his family owned a cabin. Each location became a silent cemetery, layered with the secrets of boys who'd been erased from their lives. By 1973, Henley was no longer just an accomplice. He was an executioner. He claimed to have personally strangled or shot at least 6 victims. In one instance, he tied up a boy who begged for his life, watched Corll assault him, then finished the job himself. The killings had become routine, a callous cycle. Victims were chosen, tricked, tied, and murdered. Some were tortured with hot wires. Others had their genitals mutilated. Some endured repeated assaults before they were killed. It was a machine of cruelty running in the middle of a sleepy neighborhood, completely unnoticed. But everything changed on August 8, 1973. That night, Henley invited 2 friends, 17-year-old Timothy Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams, over to Corll's home. It was supposed to be just another night of partying. Corll had alcohol, sniffing glue, and the same predatory patience he always showed. But when he saw that Henley had brought a girl, his reaction was instant and furious. He locked all 3 teens in the room. First, he handcuffed Henley to the torture board, then tied up Curley and Williams. Corll yelled that he was going to kill them all. Henley, terrified and sobered by the reality of his situation, begged Corll to spare him. He promised obedience. Corll relented. He released Henley, who stood by as Corll continued preparing to kill the others. But in that moment, something broke inside Henley. As Corll turned his back and set down his gun, Henley saw his only chance. He picked it up, aimed, and pulled the trigger. 6 shots later, Corll was dead. What followed was not a cover-up. It was an unfiltered confession. Henley called police early that morning and gave them the address of the house. When officers arrived, he was waiting calmly outside with Curley and Williams. Inside, Corll's body lay sprawled on the floor. What police didn't yet realize was that this single shooting had just unlocked one of the worst serial murder cases in American history. Henley told them everything. Names, dates, locations. He described the torture board, the buried bodies, the places where boys had been murdered and discarded. He didn't hesitate. Over the next 48 hours, Houston law enforcement began uncovering the bodies. One after another. In the rented boat shed alone, they found 17 corpses. Some buried in shallow graves, others packed tightly beneath the floorboards. The stench of decay was overwhelming. The horror of it even worse. But the shed was only the beginning. They moved next to a remote stretch of woods near Lake Sam Rayburn, where Corll's family once kept a cabin. There, in the mossy soil beneath tangled roots and pine needles, investigators unearthed more remains. Then came High Island Beach, desolate, windswept, and marked by no signs of death until the shovels hit bone. Bodies had been stashed in dune hollows, wrapped tightly in plastic sheeting, some reduced to skeletal fragments. Each discovery added to the mounting dread. These weren't just victims. They were boys, most between 13 and 17, their lives stolen with mechanical cruelty, then buried as if they were nothing. By August 13th, just 5 days after Corll's death, 27 bodies had been recovered. One more would be identified a decade later in 1983 through DNA analysis, bringing the official victim count to 28. The real number, however, is suspected to be even higher. Some families still don't know what happened to their missing sons. And for every body that surfaced, there were fresh revelations of pain. Ropes tied deep into decomposed skin, gags fused to jawbones, even signs that some had been buried alive after passing out from blood loss or drug overdose. These weren't just killings. They were executions wrapped in sadism. Some victims had genitals removed. Others had been tortured for hours, even days. The plywood torture board, that had once seemed like the stuff of horror fiction, was now very real, propped up inside a police evidence room with dried blood still on its surface. Crime scene photos showed the wall where it had once hung, fitted with handcuffs and holes drilled for additional restraints. In the corner sat coils of cord, duct tape, surgical instruments, and jars of Vaseline. Each object confirmed what the accomplices had said. This wasn't a crime of passion or impulse. It was a system. The community that had once trusted Dean Corll recoiled. Families who once welcomed him with a wave now realized he had sat at dinner tables with parents whose children he had already killed. Even neighbors admitted they had heard strange noises. Screams, hammering, arguments, but had brushed them off. Nobody thought to investigate. The victims, mostly poor and working class, were too often presumed delinquent, expendable, or simply lost in the shuffle. Many parents were immigrants or held multiple jobs, and their concerns were never given the urgency they deserved. Some were even accused of bad parenting when they begged police to look for their sons. In court, Henley's testimony was staggering. He described how victims were chosen. Lonely boys with nowhere to go, strangers met on street corners, friends from school. He admitted to actively restraining them, sometimes killing them directly under Corll's orders. His recounting of the night he killed Corll included details that would normally strain credibility, but each point matched the evidence. In his words, "I couldn't take it anymore. He was going to kill all of us. So I shot him." Prosecutors charged Henley with 6 counts of murder. He was tried in 1974. The trial drew national attention, with courtrooms packed daily. Photos of the torture board were introduced into evidence. Diagrams of burial sites, testimony from families, and graphic forensic reports were read aloud. One medical examiner broke down on the stand describing the condition of a boy's body, bound, blindfolded, with broken ribs and ligature marks around the neck. Henley sat stone-faced through most of it. The jury didn't take long. Henley was convicted and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, effectively over 500 years behind bars. To this day, he remains in prison, having been denied parole at every hearing. At times, he has expressed remorse. At others, he has downplayed his role, insisting he was brainwashed, groomed, and too afraid to escape. But the facts are indisputable. He helped kidnap and kill teenage boys, and he pulled the trigger himself more than once. David Brooks, Corll's first accomplice, faced trial the following year. His case was less dramatic. He had confessed early and tried to minimize his role, claiming he never killed anyone directly. But prosecutors proved he was complicit in multiple abductions and had participated in the burial of bodies. In 1975, Brooks was sentenced to life in prison. He remained incarcerated until his death from COVID-19 complications in 2020. With both accomplices behind bars and Corll dead, the case entered a new phase, one of reckoning. Investigators began re-examining other unsolved disappearances in the region, hoping to close gaps. Forensic teams went through the burial sites again, hoping to identify the unknowns. Among the leaders in this effort was Dr. Sharon Derrick, a forensic anthropologist who spent years using facial reconstruction, dental records, and DNA to give names back to the nameless. Her work brought closure to families who had long given up hope. One such case was Donnie Joseph Falcon. Missing since 1971, he was finally identified decades later thanks to advances in forensic technology. Other victims, though, still rest under markers labeled only as unknown white male or skeletal remains number 8. For many families, the wound never closed. The silence surrounding these boys during the years they disappeared mirrored the silence they faced in death. No headlines, no justice, no urgency. The story of Dean Corll would become known as the Houston mass murders, the worst serial killing case in the United States up to that point. It shattered illusions about who commits evil and where they hide. Corll wasn't a shadowy figure from the underworld. He was a neighbor, a candy store worker, someone parents trusted around their children. The fact that he operated for years without detection speaks to a larger systemic failure. Society's tendency to overlook the marginalized, dismiss the poor, and ignore what doesn't fit the narrative. Writers like Truman Capote initially set out to document the story, but even he eventually backed away. The horror, he said, was too great to capture on paper. But that hasn't stopped the world from trying to understand. In 2025, Investigation Discovery aired a new documentary, The Serial Killer's Apprentice, featuring Henley's first public interview in half a century. In it, he recounted his role, his manipulation by Corll, and his belief that he too was a victim. Critics argue that giving him a voice only re-traumatizes families. Supporters say it may help prevent future cases by showing how easily someone can be lured into evil. What's undeniable is the legacy Corll left behind. A legacy of questions, of missing boys, of systemic silence. Why weren't parents listened to? Why did police dismiss so many red flags? And how did two teenage boys become accomplices in something so horrific without anyone noticing? The questions echo louder with time. Because this wasn't just a story of a serial killer. It was a story of what happens when a community fails its most vulnerable. What makes the story of Dean Corll, the so-called Candyman killer, so unsettling isn't just the brutality of his crimes. It's the way those crimes happened in plain sight, in a normal neighborhood, under fluorescent porch lights and beside picket fences. With no creepy van, no masks, no menacing presence. Just a friendly man handing out sweets, while burying bodies in sheds and dunes. The final batch of this story isn't just a conclusion. It's a confrontation with the way evil often presents itself, not as monstrous, but as familiar, helpful, and even kind. After the media frenzy died down and the courtroom doors closed behind Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks, Houston tried to return to normal. But there was no going back. The empty bedrooms remained. The closets with folded clothes that would never be worn again. Schools held moments of silence for students who were no longer listed on the attendance sheet. Some families moved away, unable to walk past Corll's old address or see the streets where their children last stood. Others stayed, dedicating their lives to keeping their lost sons' names from fading. Corll's home at 2020 Lamar Drive was eventually torn down. The boat shed was emptied, cleared, and later replaced. But the land held memory. Journalists, true crime authors, even conspiracy theorists would visit those locations in the decades that followed. Each step, each photo, each grain of dirt seemed to ask the same thing. How? How did one man manage to destroy so many lives while maintaining the appearance of generosity? How did an entire system, from the police to the press, fail so completely? Part of the answer lies in Corll's deliberate manipulation. He selected victims who lived on the margins. Boys from broken homes, runaways, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and didn't always have the time or the power to raise a public outcry. He gave them just enough to trust him. A place to crash, beer, weed, pocket money, and above all, attention. That attention was weaponized. For Brooks and Henley, the grooming began early. Corll offered them freedom, something teenage boys always crave, and backed it with money, cigarettes, and the kind of validation they weren't getting elsewhere. In many ways, their descent into complicity was methodical. First as observers, then as assistants, then as full participants. By the time either of them realized how far they'd gone, there was no clean way back. Brooks, more passive than Henley, always insisted he never laid a hand on a victim, but his actions told a different story. He helped carry unconscious boys into Corll's house. He helped dispose of bodies. He took money for each new victim delivered. Whether he pulled a trigger or not, the path he walked left the same devastation. Henley, in contrast, was more involved. His trial established beyond doubt that he tied victims up. He restrained them to the torture board. He even shot one. But his decision to end Corll's spree, by turning the gun on the man he once called a friend, has kept his story tangled in debate. Was he a murderer or a reluctant whistleblower? A teen trapped in a nightmare or an opportunist who only spoke when he feared for his own life? The parole board has never had much doubt. Henley has been eligible for parole several times since the late 1980s. He's been denied every time. Meanwhile, the legacy of the Houston mass murders lives on in criminal psychology studies, forensic science textbooks, and true crime circles. The case shifted how law enforcement handles missing children, especially boys. Before Corll, it wasn't uncommon for authorities to dismiss missing teens as runaways without a second thought. After the case broke, pressure mounted to create national databases, improve response times, and treat every disappearance with urgency. One of the most important contributions to that legacy came from Dr. Sharon Derrick, the forensic anthropologist who spent decades identifying remains from Corll's known burial sites. Her work wasn't just technical, it was personal. She met with surviving family members, reconstructed faces from skulls, cross-referenced dental records, and gave some victims back their names. She restored dignity to those whom Corll had tried to erase. But many still remain unidentified. Even today, Houston's cold case unit continues to follow leads and re-examine forensic evidence. Some believe there may be more victims, buried deeper, dumped elsewhere, or killed before Corll began using Brooks and Henley. The timeline is vague in the late 1960s, and Corll had access to multiple isolated properties. His use of lime to accelerate decomposition and his habit of wrapping bodies in layers of plastic meant some evidence simply disintegrated over time. In 2025, the release of The Serial Killer's Apprentice reignited interest in the case. The documentary aired Henley's first televised interview in 50 years, capturing the public's attention in ways both morbid and instructive. Henley spoke of his manipulation, the psychological control Corll exerted, and his belief that Corll would have killed him had he not acted first. He described the night of August 8, 1973, with clinical precision. And then, almost quietly, he said, "It's not something you escape. It stays in your bones." For many, the documentary felt exploitative, giving screen time to a man who helped end dozens of lives. For others, it was a chilling window into how predators groom not just victims, but accomplices. The documentary spurred panel discussions, think pieces, and renewed calls for better education around child exploitation, manipulation, and community vigilance. Because this isn't just a historical case. It's a warning. Evil doesn't always come in a mask. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it hands out candy. Sometimes it builds trust, only to twist it into something unrecognizable. Dean Corll didn't need a dark alley. He had a clean house. He didn't use fear. He used friendship. And in that gap between appearance and truth, he created one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. For the families left behind, justice didn't bring closure. There is no closure when birthdays pass without candles, when missing posters are replaced by gravestones, and when trauma is passed like inheritance from one generation to the next. Some parents died before ever learning what happened to their sons. Others lived long enough to watch society forget. But they haven't, and neither should we. The Candyman killer case is a haunting reminder that evil often hides behind charm, and that justice, when it arrives, is never clean, never enough, and never the end. It's only a beginning, the beginning of remembering the names, demanding better from the systems that failed, and looking harder always at what lies behind the smile. If you found this story compelling, disturbing, or eye-opening, make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more chilling true crime cases and long-forgotten horrors hidden behind suburban fences and friendly faces.